Hello everyone, welcome back for another presentation on the APUSH curriculum. We've got Key Concept 3.2.3 today, American Politics and Society in the Early Republic. So at this point we're out of what is known as the critical period, the time period from the end of the Revolutionary War up till the drafting and ratification of our Constitution that we still have today. We now enter this early Republican era in which the Constitution is being tested to see if it's going to be effective. This term, the Early Republic, goes probably until about 1825 or so. It's probably a good date for cutting off that term. So let's jump right into this. Alright, so the first thing we're going to look at are politics of the Early Republic, specifically the presidential administrations of George Washington and John Adams, our first two presidents. It says here that during their presidency they set many precedents. Now, precedents is not the same word as president. Precedent means doing something that's setting an example for future presidents, future leaders to follow. It's an example that preceded the others, and the others should do well to follow those traditions that are set up. Alright, so George Washington was our first president, 1789 to 1797. So originally, he was basically just offered the job even back during the Articles of Confederation. He said, whoa, why are you offering me this job of being this leader, this executive, when we just fought a war to get rid of an all-powerful leader like King George III? So, in the Constitution, it says presidents can be elected to 4-year terms. At first, there was no limitation on terms, so really, no one ran against him. He ran unopposed. He was pretty universally admired within the United States. I can say that now, the United States. All the way back to the French and Indian War, people knew him. In the Revolution, he was the general, the commander of the Continental Forces, so the American forces. So there's this old phrase how he was first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of our countrymen. Basically, people back then, remember the nation's 99.999% Christian at the time. God's right at the top. George Washington's a very close second. Everyone admired him, so he was the obvious choice. He runs, he gets elected. His vice president is going to be John Adams. Now, one thing that has to be decided is the president can't do everything. There's so much that goes along with the job. So a precedent that he sets is the creation of a cabinet. So creating different departments within the executive branch, and then appointing sort of meritorious people into the positions to run those parts of the executive branch and then report to the president on what's going on. So people in this first cabinet, Thomas Jefferson was his Secretary of State, so dealing with all foreign relations and overseeing how we dealt with other nations as a country ourselves. Alexander Hamilton was Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton and Jefferson are bitter enemies, but George Washington was a political moderate. He valued merit regardless of their party. So he tended to favor the Federalist Party, but he was not officially a member of it. So he had Federalists and Democratic Republicans, the parties that develop here, within his own cabinet, so he could hear really all perspectives. Other cabinet members, Henry Knox, Secretary of War, and then I think his name was Edmund Randolph for Attorney General. Those last two you don't really need to know. Okay, other things is the Constitution is a little bit vague on how parts of the government operate, such as the court system. Now, what it says about the court system is there should be a Supreme Court, the Supreme Court should have a Chief Justice, and the rest of the court system is basically decided by Congress. So, one of Congress's first acts, other than the Bill of Rights when they meet, is to decide what that court structure is going to be. And they create a federal court structure. They break the country up into more or less districts. They have federal judges, and then states get to manage their own courts for locally committed crimes, I suppose. So I bring up the Judiciary Act of 1789 because we're going to talk about it later on when we talk more about the Supreme Court. Okay, another one was to decide, just hit my desk. Where is our national capital going to be set? For some time it was in New York, for some time it was in Philadelphia. But there was kind of this this disagreement about where it should be in terms of the region of the country. We already had this idea of sectionalism happening, where the South is creating this economic system with slavery. The North is all about shipping and now manufacturing and getting further away from slavery, and some states even getting rid of it. So, where's the country going to be set? Ideally somewhere in the middle, but no one can really decide because, of course, cities are going to say, we want to be the capital. It would favor themselves economically and politically. What essentially happened was, in the meantime, Alexander Hamilton was trying to get a financial plan passed through Congress to assume states' debts and to set up a national debt whereby the national government spends more money than it has in order to build credit with other nations around the world. Now, Hamilton was a Federalist. The Democratic Republicans wanted the capital in the South. So what happened, if you know the musical Hamilton, which I'm sure a lot of you do at this point, is the song The Room Where It Happened, okay? Where basically there's kind of this tit-for-tat agreement where Hamilton gets his financial plan supported by the Democratic Republicans. In return, the capital is technically placed in the South. Now, ultimately, Hamilton kind of gets the upper hand here because the financial plan applies to the whole country, and the capital is actually right on the border with the South and the North. Okay, but they had to decide where's the capital going to be in the first place. Right. Something that happened during George Washington's presidency was the Whiskey Rebellion. So if you remember Shays' Rebellion, think of this as a successor to that a few years later. Angry farmers about an increase on taxes. Now what happened here is taxes had been increased on grain. Okay, obviously the government's trying to get more money to fund things. So farmers didn't like this, so what they did is they started processing their grain into whiskey. Okay, if you ferment it, that's how you get alcohol. So what the government did is then it created a tax that also taxed whiskey and the processing of grain into whiskey. Okay, farmers thought they found a loophole, and they basically couldn't get around it. So they rebelled. They started doing similar things to Shays' Rebellion, taking over courts, having a mob, preventing the taxes from being collected. So what's different now is, though, we have a federal government that has the ability to tax and the money and the power in order to suppress a rebellion. Okay, it controls, the president controls the military as commander-in-chief. So federal government crushes this rebellion, and Washington is actually the one leading the forces. It's the only time it's happened in our history where the president and commander-in-chief is the one leading troops into battle. So it was quickly suppressed, and many people saw this and said, okay, the Constitution is working because we could not put down this Shays' Rebellion before the Constitution. We had a similar one, and it was quickly suppressed. So moving right forward, the Constitution appears to be working. All right, so George Washington served 2 terms and he decided not to run again. That is an issue so important, we're going to dedicate a whole slide to it at the end of this historical period. But just know, he could have run really unopposed, okay, because people liked him so much. He decides not to, so what happens is at the next election it's held, and his vice president, John Adams, is elected president. So he only serves for 1 term, mostly because he was fairly unpopular. He had a sour personality. But here's the thing. He was a very competent person. He helped write the Declaration of Independence. He'd worked in foreign relations during the Articles of Confederation government. He was vice president during this time, so he served as the president of the Senate. So he had a lot of experience, very competent, not well liked, certainly no Washington. Okay, so he was Washington's VP. He said the job was thankless and the most useless job in all of the federal government. Other things just about him, we'll talk about kind of his policies in other slides where they fit better. He was the first president to live in the White House. His enemies called him his rotundity because he was rather round and short, and he lost re-election in 1800 to Thomas Jefferson. All right, so that's a lengthy one. What we're talking about here are political parties and kind of their plans for what's going to happen within this new federal government. Okay, so one of the parties that I've mentioned before was the Democratic Republican Party. Its leaders were Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Okay, these are basically the descendants, so to speak, of the anti-federalists from the constitutional ratification debate. Okay? As such, they tended to be farmers or immigrants from the West and from the South. Now something kind of new, because of our relations with foreign government, they favored an alliance with France, because at the time, France was undergoing its own revolution. Jefferson saw it as related to ours, caused by it, similar in ideas, so he said we should be openly supportive of this revolution. The other party kept the name from who they were during the debate over the Constitution. That's the Federalist Party. Now notice the word Federalist and Federalism are pretty much the same. It means that they support this idea of having one part of the government having a lot of centralized power. Okay, George Washington and John Adams count as federal presidents, but really kind of the leader with all the ideas was Alexander Hamilton. Now he had some scandals in his personal life that prevented him from ever serving in elected office. He was a bit too much of a firebrand and controversial, but he was leading the ideas behind all this. Okay, who did they tend to be? Merchants, so people involved in trade, and the elites in the north and east from New England. They favored a British alliance. They actually favored copying the British system of an economy to create us into a more modern nation, and favored a strong central government, which of course they got in the Constitution, which you can see why they tended to rule the government at first, because there was support for the Constitution, there's support for the Federalist Party. Okay, so Hamilton as a Federalist had this financial plan that I mentioned on the previous slide, and it was controversial. Here's all the details. One aspect was it was going to assume states' debts. So remember, states during the Articles of Confederation operated fairly autonomously from the national government because the national government was pretty powerless. Okay? Hamilton said the federal government should take on the states' debts and create a national debt. And I know, when we look at our national debt today, it's how many trillions of dollars? Probably up in 20 or so now. It's August 11th, 2017, to give a reference point. But back then we didn't really have one. Hamilton wants to create one because he said if we spend more than we have to borrow money. And if people have their money invested in our government, they will want our government to be successful so they can get paid back. So he was kind of leveraging the success of our nation and its economy on other people's trust in it. And here's the thing. Hamilton was brilliant in this way. That's how banking works and how money works. It has nothing to do with kind of like physical value, like intrinsic value. It has to do with the trust that people have in the system. When people don't trust the system, it falls apart. He knew we had no trust because we were a new country and we had to build it up. Now, to go along with this plan, he wanted to create a national bank. And what I mean by national bank is I don't mean a bank where we as personal individuals put our money for safekeeping. It's the place where institutions and where the government places the funds that it has and then lends out that money in a certain way in order to turn a profit. Okay, and he wanted all the states' sort of treasuries, so to speak, and the federal treasury to be centralized so that money could be operated with one unified goal. Now, this would have followed a loose interpretation of the Constitution. Okay, loose interpretation means that there's that elastic clause that I mentioned before. Remember, wiggle room, room to grow, room to shrink. He said, sure, the Constitution doesn't say that Congress has the power to create the national bank, but the elastic clause says they can do what's necessary and proper at the time, and we need this to develop as a country. Okay, Jefferson strongly opposed this, and there were a lot of sort of struggles within cabinet meetings over issues such as this. Okay, he didn't want increased centralized power, wanted a limited government with state banks running these funds instead. Last part of his financial plan was tariffs. Tariff is when you put a tax on foreign imports. So imports are goods being bought from other countries. He said if we put a tax on buying other goods from other countries, people will buy locally made goods instead and help our country develop its economy rather than like England develop their economy. He wanted to protect American factories, which he saw as the future of our economy. Now, the last thing and a major thing they differed on was the balance between liberty and order. Okay, this is the idea of what is more important, guaranteeing people's rights or guaranteeing public safety. Okay, a few examples of this. So Federalists tended to be the ones that said order and preventing chaos in this early government is more important than people's rights. They were the ones that said, we don't really need a Bill of Rights. We'll just protect them because we're a virtuous government. Okay? This is very clear from what they do that their intentions weren't always pure. So, a few things passed by Congress and approved by President John Adams that limited some people's liberties. Naturalization Act increased how long you had to live here to become a citizen. Now, this was in the Federalists' favor because most immigrants came and once they became citizens, voted for, it says it at the top of the page, the other party, the Democratic Republicans. So, by increasing the residency, he could guarantee that the Federalists might win elections for a little bit longer before these immigrants could vote. Another one was the Alien Act, which basically made it that the government could deport foreigners without due process, so that means without having a real court trial, and basically they could do it because they felt like it. Now the last one, and this is sort of the most extreme one, in my opinion, is the Sedition Act, which made it illegal to criticize the government. Think about that. That means that is violating freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of petition, all these things that are hallowed within the very Constitution that was just created years before. Okay? And you can see they were trying to keep order. A lot of this had to do with being wary of the French Revolution, but it limited people's rights as well. Okay, so what happened? State governments that were controlled by the Democratic Republicans, mostly in the South, said, well, we don't want to enforce these. Let's make laws that say we're not going to enforce these laws that we don't want to. So Virginia and Kentucky created laws that limited the enforcement. So sure, there was the federal law, which was supreme, but each of these states had laws on the books that made it almost impossible for the states to actually enforce them. So they said that they could not, send the foreigners to the federal government, all these various things, okay? They limited the enforcement. They said, we don't agree with it. We're not going to make it happen. Now, this is important because the same idea is going to come back in something called the nullification crisis in period 4, and then the Civil War, maybe you've heard of it, in period 5, where states don't want to follow federal laws, okay? This is set up from way, way, way back when. All right, so this one should be a bit shorter. Basically, all the way up through the Civil War, we've got to check in with what's going on with slavery every once in a while. And within this time period of the early republic, so think 1790s, early 1800s, slavery is expanding into the Deep South and into the upper Midwest. Okay, but because these regions, the North and the South, are differing in their economies and their societies, they're differing on their approach to slavery. So, there were some new methods of achieving freedom for slaves. Thousands were freed by the British during the war, and their freedom was not challenged after the Revolution. Another new thing is manumission. Okay, kind of a funny word. The way to think about it is the word like man, so like the M-A-N-U, it's a root that has to do with hands, right? So, lavos los manos, when you're in the bathroom. Manual labor. It's the idea of, by sort of the gesture of the master, they are manually, literally emancipating, freeing their former slave. Okay, so some states put laws in place that forbade this. So Virginia depended on slavery for their economy. They made sure this couldn't happen so that the slave system would remain. But this was largely observed up in the North, and in fact, if you look at the bottom right for that map, you see the number of slaves in the North, in the South, and it's a little blurry, but the percentages are there. These are on the wall in my classroom as well if you ever want a closer peek. But you can see if those darker colors mean that, so like the purple, that means there's no slaves, okay? But the lighter the color is, the higher percentage of the local population of slaves. It's growing in the South, it's shrinking in the North. Okay. Another issue was gradual emancipation, saying that as a slave, I'm not going to free you, but if you have kids, your kids will be freed at the age of 25. Now, the South feared this as well, obviously because one of the reasons their system worked was because by letting their slaves have children, they were creating a brand new supply of slaves so they didn't have to buy new ones. Okay. If this spread throughout the country, they would no longer have this endless supply of slavery for the rest of history. All right, Enlightenment ideas were challenging slavery as well. This is the first time we're seeing this term abolitionists. Abolition, it means to like abolish something, specifically abolishing slavery. Quakers are the first to be in favor of that. Remember, Quakers were radicals even during the colonial era, the first to promote religious toleration and promote open immigration to Pennsylvania. They're the ones that are pacifists, so they opposed having a war with Britain, and now they're the first ones to say that slavery should be gone entirely. Now, despite these steps forward for methods of freedom for former slaves, that didn't mean that racism or social discrimination was over. In fact, we're going to see all the way up through the Civil War and beyond that just because Northerners didn't want slavery to be the system or to exist didn't mean that they also wanted black people living near them or going to school with their children or even getting an education. Abolitionists were not in favor of political rights for blacks. They just didn't want slavery to exist because they viewed the system as immoral. All right, what's happening in the South? Land-wise, people are expanding, people are moving into these new states, and we're going to see eventually in a later presentation that as there's more people in areas, they can apply for statehood. So Kentucky and Tennessee are the first newly admitted states in the South. Now these are happening west of the Chesapeake. Remember, the Chesapeake is where the very wealthy land-owning, slave-owning, plantation-owning people lived. If you wanted to get land and start anew, you were going to have to move further west because all the good land next to the coast was taken. There's a little just statistic here in case you can't read the map. By 1800, 1% of the northern population were slaves, 1/3 of the southern population were slaves. And that's really not going to change much all the way up through the Civil War. So the idea that slavery was disappearing in the South is a complete myth. Don't let apologists tell you otherwise. All right, so that's kind of a weird one, but a fun one to end on. So something about me that I'll mention in class at some point. I love art history. So I minored it in college, and if I had planned things better, I would have double majored in it because I took it in high school with AP Art History. I love it to death. It's a passion of mine. I'll never be able to teach it because I don't have the right credential. But here's our chance to talk about American art and how it was developing. Okay. Something to know, first of all, is the centers of artistic learning were in Europe. So that meant that there weren't many well-trained American artists. A couple names to go along with those that were actually trained are Gilbert Stuart and John Singleton Copley. So when you see portraits of the founding fathers, such as the one to the right of George Washington, typically it was them doing the work. Okay, the one to the right is by Gilbert Stuart. He was probably the most gifted, and his style is the most recognizable of this kind of Federalist era in the early Republic. Okay, most art of this era is portraiture of the elite because they could afford to pay the gifted artists to make portraits of them. If you didn't have as much money, you're probably going to have a weird kind of wonky looking portrait. So go to the back of my room sometime, look at the Founding Fathers portrait, and look at poor Roger Sherman. Poor guy, it's a horrible portrait. He kind of looks like a fish. Okay, check it out. But just realize art was developing much more in Europe than in America. Those who could do art in America had gone to Europe for the training. Otherwise, it was kind of like a trade rather than, well, an art. Okay, so that's how kind of painting was going. There wasn't much painting otherwise. All right, next up, architecture. Couple examples. So Thomas Jefferson was an architect himself. He was kind of one of these Renaissance men dabbled in many different things. So to the right there is his estate Monticello that he designed himself inside and out. And he also was the architect for the University of Virginia. Okay. Now what you're going to notice about this style is it's something called a neoclassical. Okay. It's the idea that it's drawing on Roman and Greek inspirations with things like columns, pediments. When we get into Roman, you have kind of rotundas with domes, okay, with a very ordered look to it rather than just kind of mishmash that often happens when you're, building things by the seat of your pants. He said we need kind of this classical kind of structured architecture to represent this new, very structured constitution and country that we have developed. And this idea branched down into how Washington, D.C. was planned out. Now, most cities in Europe basically kind of just built up over the years. Okay, that's why when you go to some, the streets aren't very ordered. Okay, it's hard to get around because the streets are very old. Okay, and you have to tear down a whole bunch of buildings in order to make it ordered, such as happened in Paris in the 1860s, 1870s. That's why Paris is so easy to get around. I love Paris. Washington, D.C. was a brand new city basically being built in a swamp. So they could plan it from the ground, I suppose the very wet ground, up. Okay, so they planned everything, especially government buildings, with neoclassical designs. That's why when you look at the White House, the Capitol, the Supreme Court, all these different things are built with a vision in mind of showing how our government is echoing past values when we look at sort of the Enlightenment and ancient Greece and Rome. So in fact, if you think about like our national mall that's in Washington, D.C., it's kind of like the Forum as it existed in the Roman Republic, this area of learning, this area of enlightenment where people could go and talk and move about and participate in their government, in their capital. Okay, literature, our last thing to talk about. Two terms that go along with literature of this era is Federalist literature, which I have 0 examples for you of. Probably pretty boring to read, but Romantic literature is involved there too, and I'm going to talk about that more when we get to period 4 because it's developed more at that point. What we do notice about this literature is it has a distinct American identity and subject matter. Remember, we're a new country and we're creating a national culture, something that, what does it mean to be an American instead of a former British subject? So, when authors are writing, such as James Fenimore Cooper, he's setting his stories on the American frontier, dealing with cooperation and conflict with Native Americans, which was something distinctly American and not something that Europeans could really sort of associate themselves with. By setting stories in America, you're making it more distinctly American and revealing what it meant to be an American in the first place. Some of his most famous writings, so The Last of the Mohicans, was part of his Leather Stocking Tales, which was all these stories about sort of a frontiersman dealing with the natives and dealing with all his adventures and conflicts with the expanding nation in early America. Alright, thank you for watching as always. That one was a little awkward at times. Sorry about that, but that's just me. There are your next steps. Keep right on track with those, and I will see you next time.